Do you think your childhood kung fu tricks are going to scare me? Brad growled, blood dripping from his broken nose onto the white-tiled floor of the bathroom. This isn't kung fu, Brian replied quietly, his green eyes burning with cold fire. And you haven't seen what I'm capable of yet. Oh, really? Brad wiped blood from his lip and sneered. Then show me, you ginger bastard. Show me. What happened next changed not only Brian Meyer's life forever, but also the lives of everyone who witnessed that day at St. Vincent College. The most interesting part is yet to come. Stay with us to find out how it all ended. In the meantime, like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows of St. Vincent College in Austin, Texas, creating long strips of light on the polished linoleum of the hallway. 18-year-old Brian Myers clutched his engineering textbooks to his chest, his fiery red hair standing out like a beacon among the crowd of students rushing to morning lectures. His freckled face bore the marks of a sleepless night. Faint dark circles under his eyes indicated that sleep had once again eluded him. Brian was a newcomer at St. Vincent, a freshman. It had only been a week since his family moved from the quiet suburbs of Portland, Oregon, after his mother landed a prestigious position as a lead engineer in battery technology at Tesla's research center in Austin. The move had been painful, leaving behind friends, a familiar life, and the dojo where he had studied Wing Chun for the past 8 years under Master Chen, a 70-year-old Chinese immigrant who had become a second father and spiritual mentor to him. Every morning at 5:30, Brian woke up and spent 45 minutes practicing his forms in the complete silence of his new room. The movements were slow, precise, each gesture carrying years of discipline and understanding. His body remembered every technique, every principle that Master Chen had instilled in him. Martial arts are not for demonstrating strength, Master Chen's words echoed in Brian's mind every morning. It is a path of self-discipline, protecting the defenseless and finding inner peace. A true warrior wins without fighting. But Master Chen also taught him to be a realist. In an ideal world, strength would never have to be applied, he said during their last training session in Portland. But the world is not ideal, Brian. And sometimes the only way to protect the innocent is to show aggressors that their actions will have consequences. Brian never told his classmates about his skills. In high school in Portland, he was known as the quiet, smart guy with unusual red hair and freckles, who helped younger students with math and physics, played chess in the school club, and read philosophy books in his free time. Here in Texas, he hoped for a fresh start, a place where he could just be an ordinary student, focus on his studies, and perhaps find true friends. But Brad Harrison noticed him from day one. Brad was the embodiment of everything Brian despised in human nature. 20 years old, 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered like a quarterback on the football team, with light hair slicked back with expensive gel, and a predatory smile that could charm professors and instill fear in weaker students. His father, Richard Harrison, owned a chain of successful car dealerships throughout Austin and was a major sponsor of the college's sports programs. This gave Brad a sense of impunity that he exploited to the fullest. Always by his side were his loyal henchmen, Michael Mike Stone, a stocky guy standing 5'9" with a bull neck and an eagle tattoo on his forearm, whose father worked as a sergeant at the police station, adding another layer of protection for the group against the consequences of their actions. Mike was the type of person who reveled in others' pain and considered cruelty a sign of strength. Next to him was always Tom Johnson, tall and thin at 178, with piercing blue eyes and a habit of constantly snapping his fingers. Tom was the most brutal of the trio. He derived sadistic pleasure from the psychological torment of his victims. "Hey, look who's coming!" Brad's voice sliced through the morning buzz of the corridor like a knife. Carrot Top in the flesh. His voice was loud, theatrical, designed to attract the attention of as many witnesses as possible. Brad always preferred public humiliations. They were more effective. Brian slowed his pace, his grip on his textbooks tightening to the point where his knuckles turned white. He saw other students quickly avert their gazes and quicken their steps, not wanting to witness what was about to happen. At St. Vincent's, everyone knew the unspoken rule. If Brad Harrison had chosen you as a target, it was better not to intervene, or you might become the next victim. Brian noticed a student named Sarah Jones, who sat next to him in literature class, quickly veer into a side corridor, pretending not to see what was happening. Another student, Marcus Brown, with whom Brian had exchanged a few words last week, suddenly became very interested in the contents of his locker. "I'm talking to you, Fireball." Brad blocked Brian's path, his massive figure casting a long shadow over the red-haired teenager. Mike and Tom flanked him, forming a triangle. This was a well-rehearsed intimidation tactic they had used many times before. "Sorry, I'm in a hurry to get to my calculus lecture." Brian tried to sidestep Brad, but he stepped sideways again, blocking the way. His movements were precise, predatory, like a wolf cornering its prey. "Calculus?" Brad whistled theatrically, his voice dripping with exaggerated surprise. "Hey, guys, we've got a real genius here. You probably think you're better than all of us, huh, Carrot Top? Think your brains make you special?" "No, I just want to get to class." Brian's voice remained calm, but his green eyes were carefully tracking the movements of the three guys. 8 years of training under Master Chen had taught him to read body language, to notice the slightest changes in an opponent's stance that preceded an attack. He saw Mike's muscles tense, how Tom shifted his weight from one foot to the other, preparing for action. Master Chen had taught him that every person unconsciously signals their intentions through the smallest changes in posture, breathing, and facial expression. "Learn to read these signs, and you'll always be one step ahead of any opponent," the old teacher would say. "And you know what, Carrot?" Brad leaned in closer, his breath smelling of energy drink and mint gum, an attempt to mask the scent of the cigarettes he smoked behind the college building. "I don't like your haircut. It's too bright for our college. You're attracting unwanted attention." Tom snickered, the sound unpleasant, almost hysterical. "Maybe we should help him with a new haircut. I've seen how they do it in the Army. Neat and tidy." "Great idea." Mike cracked his knuckles, producing a dry pop. "I have a folding knife. Let's give him a trendy bald look right here in the corridor. Let everyone see the new style." Brian's heart raced, adrenaline starting to pump through his veins, but his breathing remained controlled and steady. The meditative breathing technique that Master Chen had taught him helped maintain clarity of mind even in the most stressful situations. 4 seconds inhaling through the nose, a 2-second hold, 6 seconds exhaling through the mouth. The rhythm calmed his nervous system and allowed his brain to function at full capacity. He quickly assessed his options. The corridor was starting to empty as students hurried to their first lecture or deliberately avoided the conflict zone. The nearest faculty classroom was 15 meters away, close enough to run if necessary, but Brian understood that running away would only postpone the problem, not solve it. "Listen," Brian took a step back, giving himself more room to maneuver. "I don't want any trouble. I'm new here. I'm not bothering anyone, just trying to adapt. But I don't like you." Brad interrupted him, his voice growing colder. "Your red hair, your smart face, the way you sit at the front in all the lectures and answer the professor's questions? Are you trying to make the rest of us look like idiots? Show how special you are?" "I'm just learning." Slap! Brad's palm struck Brian's left cheek with a sound that echoed. The hit wasn't strong in a physical sense, but it was deeply humiliating. The sound reverberated down the hallway, and a few students who were still nearby stopped and stared at the scene, their faces a mix of horror and painful curiosity. "That's better," Brad smirked, admiring the red imprint of his hand on Brian's pale, freckled cheek. "Now you know your place in our little hierarchy, Ginger. Welcome to the real world." Something deep and primal inside Brian began to boil. But it wasn't simple anger. No, Master Chen had spent years teaching him to control and transform angry emotions. It was something colder, more dangerous, more controlled. A sense of justice that demanded balance, demanded a response. The words of Master Chen surfaced in his memory. "Anger is a fire that can warm a house or burn it to the ground. A wise man learns to direct that fire where it will be beneficial." But instead of acting, Brian simply nodded slowly and said quietly, "Got it." His voice was calm, almost emotionless, but a keen observer might have noticed a new firmness in his green eyes. "Good boy." Brad patted him on the other cheek, this time not as hard, but with enough pressure to leave another red mark. "You're a quick learner. See you later, Carrot. We still have things to talk about." The trio walked away, their self-satisfied laughter echoing down the hallway. Brad strode ahead like a conqueror, while Mike and Tom followed, exchanging knowing glances and smirks. Brian stood still for another minute, feeling the heat in both cheeks, as the remaining students looked at him with a mix of sympathy, relief that it hadn't happened to them, and shame for not intervening. Some quickly averted their eyes when he turned in their direction. "Are you okay?" A quiet voice made him turn around. A girl with shoulder-length chestnut hair and kind brown eyes stood next to him, holding a worn psychology textbook and a notebook filled with neat handwriting. He remembered her from English literature class. Anna Martinez, one of the few students who always listened attentively to lectures and asked thoughtful questions. "Yeah, I'm fine." Brian cautiously touched his left cheek, trying to assess the degree of redness and wipe away the sting. "Brad Harrison is a complete jerk." Anna shook her head, her voice filled with genuine anger. "He thinks he can do whatever he wants because his dad owns several car dealerships in Austin and donates big money to the college's sports program. The administration turns a blind eye to his antics." "Got it." Brian adjusted the strap of his backpack, trying to appear calm. "Thanks for asking. It's nice to know that not everyone here is indifferent. Listen." Anna hesitated, clearly weighing her words. "If you want, you can have lunch with us today. With my friends. We have a small group. We discuss books, movies, help each other with studies. Brad usually doesn't bother people when they're in a group. He has enough sense not to mess with multiple witnesses at once." Brian felt genuine gratitude towards this girl, but slowly shook his head. "Thank you for the offer, Anna, but I don't want to create problems for you and your friends. Guys like Brad tend to expand their circle of victims if they sense resistance." "This won't create problems," she began. "Trust me." Brian's voice carried a quiet but unwavering confidence that made Anna fall silent and look at him more closely. "It will be better if I handle this on my own. Some things need to be dealt with one-on-one." The lecture on mathematical analysis passed in a haze. Professor Johnson, an energetic middle-aged man with a mop of graying hair, explained the basics of differential calculus, drawing elegant formulas and graphs on the board. But Brian's thoughts kept drifting back to the incident in the hallway. He still felt a slight burning on both cheeks, still heard Brad's smug laughter and his friends echoing in his head. This had never happened in Portland. Sure, he was teased sometimes for his red hair. It was practically inevitable for any red-haired kid in America. Ginger, Carrot Top, Fireball. He had heard all those nicknames countless times, but no one had ever laid a hand on him. No one had dared to resort to physical violence or public humiliation. Perhaps it was because, even without knowing about his martial arts skills, the kids in Portland instinctively sensed something in him that made them keep a respectful distance. Master Chen called it inner strength, an invisible aura of confidence and self-control that develops in serious martial arts practitioners. Here, everything was different. Here he was an outsider, an easy target, a newcomer without connections or reputation. Here Brad Harrison was the alpha male, and Brian was just another weak prey to be tormented with impunity. "Mr. Myers," Professor Johnson's voice pulled him from his dark thoughts. "Can you solve this problem on the board?" Brian stood up and walked to the board, took the chalk, and began writing the solution. Math had always been a refuge for him, pure, logical, predictable. In the world of numbers and formulas, there was no room for cruelty and injustice. There was a right answer and a wrong one. There was logic and there was chaos. He quickly and confidently solved the derivative problem, his handwriting clear and neat. A few classmates gasped quietly. The problem was challenging for freshmen, and Brian tackled it faster than even the professor had expected. "Excellent," Professor Johnson nodded approvingly. "It's clear you have a solid mathematical background. Where did you study before?" "In Portland, sir, at Lincoln High School." "Great school. I'm glad to have a student of your caliber." Brian returned to his seat, ignoring the admiring glances of some classmates and the envious looks of others. He knew that his academic success would only exacerbate the situation with Brad. Guys like him hated those who excelled intellectually, especially if those people also stood out physically. After the lecture, Brian headed to his locker, number 237. The hallways of St. Vincent's were spacious and modern, with high ceilings and large panoramic windows that flooded everything with natural light. The walls were adorned with photos of outstanding alumni, sports trophies, and motivational posters. Students chatted, laughed, hurried to their next classes, exchanged textbooks and notes. A normal, healthy student life. Brian entered the lock code, Master Chen's birth date, a small tribute to his teacher, and opened the locker door. Inside lay his textbooks neatly arranged, notebooks filled with his characteristic small handwriting, a few pens and pencils, and a small photograph in a simple wooden frame. The photo was of him and Master Chen after his last advanced test, taken just 2 months ago at the dojo in Portland. Master Chen smiled his rare, almost elusive smile, the one he showed only on special occasions, while Brian held the certificate with sincere pride on his face. It was one of the happiest days of his life. Strength without wisdom is destruction, Master Chen said that day as they sat in the traditional tea room of the dojo after the ceremony. Wisdom without strength is helplessness. Find the balance between them, Brian. Always seek that balance. It is the key not only to mastery in martial arts, but also to mastery in life. Brian gently touched the photograph with his fingertips, as if trying to absorb his teacher's wisdom through simple contact, then picked up a thick physics textbook. The next lecture was dedicated to Newton's laws. The irony of the situation did not escape him. Studying the physical laws of motion and force after he had so painstakingly suppressed the desire to apply those laws in practice. The cafeteria of St. Vincent College was enormous, with high vaulted ceilings adorned with wooden beams and long oak tables that could accommodate several hundred students at once. Huge windows overlooked a courtyard with a fountain and modern sculptures, creating an almost collegiate atmosphere. The smells of various dishes mingled in the air, from traditional American food to Mexican and Asian cuisines. Brian took a tray and chose a simple meal, a fresh vegetable salad, a turkey sandwich on whole grain bread, and a glass of apple juice. He always watched his diet. Master Chen taught that the body is a tool that must be kept in perfect condition. What you eat directly affects how you think and how you move, the old teacher would repeat. Brian headed to an empty table in the far corner of the cafeteria, away from the main flow of students. He preferred to eat in relative solitude, reading or reviewing notes, using lunchtime for additional study. But today this solitude was ruthlessly interrupted. "Here comes our favorite carrot." A familiar voice made Brian slowly raise his eyes from the organic chemistry textbook he was reading, slowly chewing his sandwich. Brad Harrison approached his table, theatrically balancing a huge tray piled high with greasy food. A pair of large hamburgers with bacon, a large portion of fries, a dozen spicy chicken wings, and a giant cup of cola. Mike and Tom followed him like loyal dogs, their faces glowing with anticipation of the upcoming entertainment. "You know," Brad set his tray right across from Brian and sat down with exaggerated nonchalance. "I thought you were a bit unfriendly this morning. I tried to be nice, to extend a hand of friendship, and you acted like some kind of arrogant snob." Brian carefully closed the textbook but did not remove it from the table. The thick book served as a small but psychologically significant barrier between him and Brad. "I didn't mean to be unfriendly or come off as a snob." "Of course you didn't," Mike smirked, deliberately sitting to the right of Brian, his massive body taking up almost half the bench. Tom took a seat on the left, creating a sense of enclosure. Now Brian was trapped between three much larger guys, and the only way to retreat lay through them. Students at neighboring tables began to notice the developing situation. Some glanced over furtively, whispering to each other, while others pointedly turned away, unwilling to draw unwanted attention to themselves or witness what might happen. "I think we need to get to know each other better." Brad took a huge bite of his hamburger and began chewing with his mouth open, deliberately demonstrating disgusting manners. "Let's have a heart-to-heart, Ginger. Tell us about yourself, about your previous life. Where did you come from?" "From Portland, Oregon," Brian replied quietly, hoping that if he cooperated and answered their questions, they would quickly lose interest in him and find another source of entertainment. "Portland?" Tom snickered with an unpleasant, almost hysterical laugh. "Ah, the city of hippies and vegans? No wonder you're so weird and pale. Everyone there is such a weirdo, right? What did your parents do in that wonderful Portland?" Brad continued his interrogation, his voice dripping with sarcastic irony. "Did they grow organic marijuana for the local junkies? Or maybe brew coffee for bearded hipsters in trendy cafes?" "My dad is an architect, and my mom is an engineer." Brian felt his fists slowly clenching under the table, but he forced himself to relax his fingers. Control. Always control. "An engineer?" Brad raised his eyebrows with exaggerated theatrical surprise. "Wow, you hear that, guys? We have a whole intellectual family here. Mom, dad, and little son, all so smart and clever. What made such a smart family leave their liberal paradise and come to our humble, conservative Austin? Mom got a job at the Tesla Research Center. She works on developing new technologies for electric vehicles." "Tesla!" Mike laughed loudly, drawing the attention of students at nearby tables. "Our little Redhead's mom works for that crazy billionaire. What does she do there? Polish his space rockets? Or maybe charge batteries?" Blood rushed quickly to Brian's face. turning his freckled skin bright red. He could tolerate any mockery directed at himself, could swallow any insults thrown his way. But when it came to his family, especially his mother was one of the leading experts in battery technology. She held a PhD from MIT and had several patents to her name. She worked on technologies that could truly change the world for the better. Hearing these ignorant idiots mock her achievements and contributions to science was almost unbearable. My mother is a leading specialist in energy systems, he said, putting all his effort into maintaining a steady, controlled tone. She develops energy storage and transmission technologies that will help solve environmental problems and change the future of transportation. Ooh, Brad raised his hands in feigned theatrical fear, his voice dripping with even more mockery. Forgive me, Your Highness. I didn't know we had the honor of speaking with the son of a real superhero. Maybe we should stand and bow. Maybe his mom invented a special superhero suit for redheads, Tom chimed in, enjoying his own wit. Or maybe she's working on a secret cure for red hair. Mike couldn't stop, his laughter growing louder and more unpleasant. Then our little flame can finally look like a normal person. Brian slowly, with exaggerated dignity, stood up from the table. I need to go to my next lecture. Sit. Brad's voice suddenly turned hard, cold, devoid of any playfulness. We're not done with our friendly conversation yet. We still have many questions. I'm done with this conversation. Brian took his tray with the unfinished lunch. Brad instantly jumped up from the table and firmly grabbed Brian by the wrist. His fingers tightened enough to demonstrate strength, but not enough to cause serious pain. It was more a show of control. I said sit. When you talk to your elders, you need to listen until the end. Instantly, almost instinctively, Brian's body reacted to the physical aggression. His free hand began to move in the practiced technique of escaping a wrist grab, which he had practiced thousands of times over 8 years of training. The thumb automatically found the exact pressure point between Brad's wrist bones, while the other fingers were ready to create a lever that would force the opponent to immediately release the grip. But at the very last moment, when his hand had already begun to move, Brian stopped. He could have freed himself in a split second, could have inflicted sharp but temporary pain on Brad without leaving any visible damage. The technique had been honed to perfection. But Master Chen's voice echoed clearly and distinctly in his head. Strength without wisdom is destruction. Instead of acting, he simply stood still, allowing Brad to squeeze his wrist, demonstrating outward submission. This is much better. Brad smirked with self-satisfaction, interpreting Brian's stillness as complete submission and acknowledgement of his superiority. Sit back down and finish your rabbit food. We'll continue our enlightening conversation. Brian slowly sat back down in his place, but something fundamental had changed in the expression of his green eyes. Brad was too overconfident and intoxicated by his power to notice this change, but if Master Chen had been there in that cafeteria, he would have instantly recognized that look. It was the gaze of a predator who has made a definitive decision, the look of a person who has exhausted their patience. You know what, Ginger? Brad sat back down and demonstratively leaned against the back of the chair, assuming the pose of the absolute master of the situation. I really like it when you show respect and listen to your elders. It shows that you are starting to understand how the hierarchy works in our little college. What hierarchy? Brian asked quietly, his voice sounding with genuine curiosity. A very simple and clear hierarchy. Brad smiled broadly. There are those who have real power and influence, he pointed to himself. And there are those who obey and know their place, he pointed to Brian. Guess which category you belong to, smart guy? Mike and Tom giggled like hyenas watching the hunt of the pack's main predator, anticipating the final humiliation of the prey. And what if I don't want to obey this hierarchy? Brian's question came out with the same calm curiosity as if he were genuinely interested in an academic answer to a theoretical question. Brad slowly leaned over the table, his face coming so close to Brian's that he could smell the unpleasant odor of his breath. Then you will have it very, very bad. So bad that you will wish you were never born. How bad exactly? Brian continued to ask questions in the same unflappable tone. Something in Brian's intonation, in his complete lack of fear, made Brad momentarily pull back and look more closely at the red-haired teenager. For a second, doubt flickered in his eyes as if he sensed something potentially dangerous in this quiet, calm guy. But the moment passed, and the familiar overconfidence returned, suppressing the intuitive warning. You'll see. Brad stood up from the table and patted Brian on the shoulder with false friendliness. You'll see very soon. I promise it will be an unforgettable experience. They left the cafeteria, leaving Brian alone at the table with his unfinished lunch. He sat still for several long minutes, then mechanically opened his chemistry textbook to the same page he had been reading before they arrived. But the words and formulas blurred before his eyes, turning into meaningless symbols. In his head, two distinctly recognizable voices were engaged in an internal dialogue. The first voice was the familiar, wise voice of Master Chen, urging patience, self-control, wisdom, and the search for a peaceful resolution to conflict. The second voice was new, darker, more primal. It whispered about justice, about the balance of power, about how sometimes the only way to stop a predator is to show them that not all potential prey is defenseless. Brian closed the textbook and slowly stood up from the table. The decision had not yet been finalized, but something deep and fundamental within it was beginning to change irreversibly. At the very moment Brian was leaving the cafeteria, heading toward the exit, his phone vibrated in his pocket. A new message from an unknown number, but he immediately guessed who might have sent it. "Hey, Ginger, hope you're ready for some real fun after school. Meet me at your locker at 4. Don't be late and don't try to run away." Brian read the message carefully twice, then calmly deleted it. But he already knew exactly what would happen next. And for the first time in the entire week at St. Vincent's, he did not feel the usual fear or anxiety. Instead, a strange, cold calm settled in his chest. The next two classes, physics and English literature, passed in a surreal haze. Brian was physically present in the classrooms, neatly taking notes in his characteristic small handwriting, answering the teacher's questions when called upon. But his mind was wandering elsewhere. He thought about the balance of forces, the physical laws of action and reaction, the vulnerable points of the human body, the kind of impact one could have on an opponent to temporarily incapacitate them without causing serious injury. These thoughts both frightened and intrigued him. This was nothing like him, the person he had been just a week ago in Portland. Master Chen had spent years patiently teaching him to control such impulses, to channel aggressive energy constructively, to find peaceful solutions to conflicts. In the physics lecture, Professor Thompson, a middle-aged enthusiast with an infectious love for his subject, was explaining Newton's third law. For every action, there is always an equal and opposite reaction. These words echoed in Brian's head, taking on an almost philosophical significance. Action and reaction. Force and counterforce. Oppression and resistance. "Mr. Myers," the professor's voice suddenly pulled him from his deep thoughts. "Can you give us a practical example of Newton's third law from everyday life?" Brian slowly stood up, feeling the gaze of all the students in the class upon him. "When someone pushes you, your body automatically resists that force," and he said, his voice calm and confident. "The stronger the initial action, the stronger the body's natural response." "Excellent example," the professor nodded approvingly. "And what happens if the object to which the force is applied turns out to be more stable and resilient than the source of the force anticipated?" Brian felt the corners of his lips lift slightly in a barely noticeable but promising smile. "Then the applied force returns to its source with double, and sometimes even triple, the power, Professor." Several students in the class exchanged puzzled glances, not fully understanding why a simple explanation of a basic physical law sounded almost like a hidden threat or warning. After the lecture, Anna Martinez hurried to catch up with Brian in the hallway, her face expressing genuine concern. "Hey, Brian, are you okay? You look different, more focused." Brian stopped and looked at her closely. Anna was truly a sweet, genuinely kind girl with a pure heart. She definitely did not deserve to be accidentally caught up in what was about to happen in a few hours. "I'm fine, Anna. Just thinking about the laws of physics and their practical application in real life." "About physics?" She looked somewhat puzzled. "Brian, if Brad and his friends are bothering you again, you can always talk to Dean Martin. He has a strict policy of zero tolerance for any forms of bullying and intimidation." "And what exactly will he do?" Brian asked with sincere, almost academic curiosity. "Will he call Brad to his office? Will there be a serious disciplinary talk? Will he receive an official warning? And what will happen later when Dean Martin isn't around to monitor the situation?" Anna opened her mouth to say something reassuring, but suddenly realized that she really had no convincing answer to this logical question. "Some problems can't be solved just by turning to the official authorities." Brian gently, almost paternalistically, touched her shoulder. "Sometimes people have to solve their problems on their own. using the resources available to them. Brian, I don't like the way you're talking right now. There was a note of genuine concern in her voice. Don't worry about me, Anna. He smiled, and there was something new in that smile, something that made the girl involuntarily feel shivers running down her skin. By tomorrow morning, everything will be resolved. I promise. He walked away down the corridor, leaving Anna standing in confusion with a growing sense of anxiety and a premonition that something serious was about to happen. In the final minutes of the school day, Brian sat in English literature class, mechanically listening as Professor Wilson, a gray-haired man with piercing eyes behind thin-frame glasses, discussed the psychological motives of characters in Herman Melville's Moby Dick. Captain Ahab is completely obsessed with his desire for revenge against the white whale, the professor said, his voice resonating with academic passion. This obsession with vengeance consumes his mind, destroys him as a person, and ultimately leads to his tragic demise in the death of almost his entire crew. What do you think Melville is trying to tell us about the nature of revenge and retribution? A student in the front row, a diligent boy named Peter, raised his hand. Probably that revenge is always destructive and rarely brings satisfaction? Exactly, the professor nodded approvingly. Revenge rarely provides the moral satisfaction we expect from it. It often causes more harm to the avenger than to the object of their vengeance. Brian unexpectedly raised his hand. Professor Wilson looked pleasantly surprised. New students rarely participated in class discussions. Yes, Mr. Myers, do you have an opinion on this matter? What if it's not pure revenge, Professor? Brian stood up, his voice calm and measured. What if it's just a natural restoration of a disrupted balance of power? Interesting perspective. Can you elaborate on your thought? Brian paused for a moment, choosing his words carefully. Ahab perceived the white whale as an embodiment of injustice, as a force that needed to be stopped to restore order. But what if the whale was simply acting according to its natural instincts? What if Ahab was also just following his nature and his inner sense of justice? A curious interpretation. But doesn't the end result remain the same? No, Professor. The outcome fundamentally depends on who is stronger, smarter, better prepared, and more resolute. Brian spoke with growing confidence. Ahab suffered a tragic defeat not because the idea of restoring justice was fundamentally wrong, but because he seriously underestimated his opponent and overestimated his own abilities. The entire class fell into a tense, almost electric silence. Professor Wilson looked at Brian with new sharp interest. That's quite an unusual interpretation of a classic work, Mr. Myers. Perhaps. Brian slowly sat back down in his seat, but probably a more realistic one. When the final bell finally rang, signaling the end of the school day, Brian didn't rush to gather his things. He methodically and neatly packed his textbooks and notebooks into his backpack, then took out his phone and sent a short text message to his father. Dad, I'll be staying at college a bit longer today. I need to resolve a very important issue. I love you and Mom. Then he completely turned off his phone and leisurely headed to his locker. The college corridors were quickly emptying, students hurriedly gathering their things and rushing to the parking lot, to their cars, or to the bus stops to catch transportation home. But Brian was in no hurry. He knew exactly that someone was waiting for him. And for the first time in the entire week of being at the new college, he was not afraid of what was about to happen. At his locker number 237, he found not only the familiar trio of Brad, Mike, and Tom, but also two additional, clearly invited guests, Jake Harper and Kevin Black, players from the college rugby team. Jake stood at 182 centimeters tall with broad shoulders and a scar above his left eyebrow, while Kevin was 178 centimeters, but more stocky, with a thick neck and signs of numerous fights on his knuckles. They had a reputation for being aggressive, but not very smart fighters. 5 against 1. In a practically empty corridor where there were almost no witnesses, Brian stopped exactly 10 meters from the group, quickly and professionally assessing the tactical situation. The nearest exit was behind him, about 20 meters away, close enough for a quick retreat if he chose that path. The other exit was located directly behind the group of bullies. The classrooms on both sides of the corridor were tightly locked. The official class time had ended more than half an hour ago, and the teachers had already gone home. And here he is, Brad grinned widely, demonstratively pushing off from the metal locker. Our favorite nerd has arrived right on schedule. Punctuality is a good quality. I just came to grab my things and go home, Brian stopped a few meters from the group, maintaining a safe distance. I'm afraid it won't be that simple. Mike gestured broadly to block his way to the locker. We have a few important questions for a serious discussion. For example, what questions? For example, your disrespectful attitude towards upperclassmen. Brad slowly approached, his movements resembling those of a predator cornering its prey. I noticed that you showed serious disrespect to me personally in the cafeteria today, and I absolutely do not tolerate disrespect towards myself. Meanwhile, Jake and Kevin took strategic positions, methodically blocking all possible escape routes. They clearly knew what they were doing. It was a well-rehearsed tactic of group intimidation and victim isolation. And what exactly are you planning to do about it? Brian asked with the same calm, almost academic curiosity. Brad stopped right in front of him, looming over him with his massive figure. We are going to teach you a good lesson, Ginger, to give you an unforgettable lesson in good manners and respect for your elders. All 5 of you at once? How many do you think it will take for a guy like you? Brian slowly, almost ceremonially nodded, as if seriously contemplating a mathematical problem. Then he carefully placed his backpack on the floor next to the wall. Very good and fair question, he said quietly but clearly. Let's find out the correct answer through experimentation. Something in his tone, in the complete absence of fear or panic, made Brad momentarily doubt the correctness of his actions. But surrounded by 4 friends, he still felt absolutely invincible. Have you completely lost it, Ginger? Do you realize that it's 5 of us against 1? I can count to 5 just fine. Brian assumed a basic Wing Chun stance, slightly spreading his legs shoulder-width apart, his hands relaxed but ready for immediate action. But as you know, quantity does not always equal quality. What the hell? Mike began to say something but didn't have time to finish the phrase. Brian closed his eyes for a few seconds and took one deep, controlled breath. In his memory flashed years of intense training under Master Chen, thousands and thousands of repetitions of combat forms, philosophical discussions about the nature of conflict, the balance of power and justice. Master, he mentally addressed his distant teacher, forgive me for what I am about to do, but sometimes restoring balance truly requires decisive action. When he opened his eyes, there was no trace of fear or shadow of doubt left in them, only absolute cold determination and perfect concentration of an experienced fighter. So, gentlemen, he said with icy calm, who among you wants to receive a lesson first? Brad couldn't hold back a nervous, slightly hysterical laugh. Do you really think your childish tricks from kung fu movies will help you against 5 real fighters? First of all, this is not kung fu. Brian smiled slightly, and there was not a drop of warmth in that smile. And secondly, you will soon understand everything for yourself. Tom was the first to completely lose his patience and self-control. With a wild scream of rage, he lunged at Brian, arms wide open, trying to grab him and throw him to the floor. What happened in the next seconds took about 15 seconds of real time, but forever and radically changed the balance of power at St. Vincent College. Brian dodged Tom's clumsy grab with a minimal, almost dance-like movement to the side. His right hand automatically rose in a perfect block, gently redirecting the kinetic energy of the opponent's attack against him. Simultaneously, his left hand delivered a precise palm strike to Tom's solar plexus. Not with full force, but with a controlled impact that temporarily disrupted his breathing and coordination. Tom doubled over, gasping for air. "Tom!" Mike shouted as he rushed to help his friend. But Brian was ready. Using a simple yet effective sweep, he knocked Mike off balance and then gently but accurately struck a nerve point on his neck, a technique that temporarily disrupts movement coordination without causing harm. Mike fell to the floor, disoriented but unharmed. Jake and Kevin, experienced rugby players, realized they were dealing with no ordinary student. They attacked more cautiously, coordinating their actions, one from the right, the other from the left. Brian moved smoothly and economically, using the principles of Wing Chun to redirect their strength against them. Jake received a series of controlled body strikes, not injurious, but painful and temporarily incapacitating. Kevin was sent crashing into the lockers with an elegant throw that looked impressive, but was executed to minimize the risk of injury. All 4 attackers were now lying on the floor sitting, temporarily incapacitated but without serious damage. Brian carefully controlled each of his movements, using just enough force to neutralize the threat. Brian slowly turned to Brad, who stood in complete shock, unable to believe his own eyes. "Now it's your turn," Brian said in a completely calm tone. This This is impossible. Brad took a step back, his voice trembling. You can't. They're much bigger than you. Size doesn't always matter. Brian took a step forward. Sometimes technique, speed, and understanding of human anatomy are more important. You've lost it. I'll call my father. You'll be expelled. For self-defense against 5 attackers? Brian calmly pointed to his opponents. The security cameras will show a completely different picture. Who attacked first? Indeed, the red light of the security camera in the corner of the hallway was blinking, recording everything that was happening. Moreover, Brian continued to approach, we have unfinished business. What business? Brad's voice became high-pitched with fear. You hit me. You publicly humiliated me. You insulted my family. Brian's voice remained quiet, but each word was clear. It's time for an answer. Brad tried to run away, but Brian was faster. He caught up to him, grabbed him by the collar of his shirt, and dragged him toward the men's restroom at the end of the hallway. Let me go! Brad desperately tried to break free. Soon! Brian shoved the restroom door open. But first, we need to finish our conversation. Inside, the restroom was empty. Brian blocked the door with a chair that was standing in the corner. What are you going to do? Brad's voice trembled. Give you a lesson. Brian turned to him. A lesson about the fact that every action has consequences. Listen, maybe we can come to an agreement. Come to an agreement? Brian shook his head. Where was your willingness to negotiate when you were hitting me? When you were humiliating me? When you brought your 4 buddies? I didn't think. Exactly, you didn't think. Brian stepped closer to Brad, who backed up against the wall. But I did think. About justice, about balance, about what happens when an aggressor meets someone who can fight back. Please, please, Brian tilted his head. I also said please when I asked you to leave me alone. Remember your response? Brad pressed against the wall, his face pale. You said you'd show me my place. Brian placed his hand on the wall next to Brad's head. Now I will show you yours. What do you want? Brad whispered. Sincere apologies. For everything. Okay, I'm sorry. Forgive me. Not sincere enough. Brian shook his head. Try again, but this time with understanding. What else do you want? For you to understand what I felt, Brian stepped back a bit. Humiliation, helplessness, fear. I understand. No. Brian shook his head. Not yet, but you will. He grabbed Brad and dragged him to one of the stalls. Don't do this, Brad tried to resist. A lesson in humility. Brian shoved the stall door open. That you will remember. He forced Brad to kneel in front of the toilet. Welcome to the world of consequences, he said quietly, and for a few seconds, he plunged Brad's head into the water. The cold water hit Brad's face. Brian held him there for a short time, just enough to create a psychological effect without causing harm. Then he pulled him up. How does it feel? He asked calmly. You're crazy. Brad coughed, water dripping from his face. Maybe, Brian agreed, but I'm not the one who gathered a gang against one. I'm the one who gives a fair response. He repeated the procedure 2 more times, each time controlling the duration and intensity of the impact. When he lifted Brad for the last time, he was already crying. Please, I learned my lesson. Brian studied his face closely, then released him. Brad fell to the floor of the stall, soaked, trembling, broken. Get up, Brian ordered. Brad slowly rose, holding onto the walls. Listen carefully. Brian spoke quietly but clearly. You and your friends will never come near me again. Never speak to me. Yes, understood. If I find out that you are bullying someone else, I will come back. And next time, I won't be so restrained. Understood. And one last thing. Brian leaned in closer. If you try to get revenge, if you tell anyone about my abilities, if you go to Daddy, he didn't finish the threat. I won't tell anyone. I swear. Brian nodded and stepped back. Clean yourself up and get out. And remember, one wrong move, and I will know. Brad nodded like a bobblehead, rushed to the sink, hastily washed his face, and bolted out of the restroom. Brian was left alone. He looked at his reflection in the mirror. The same red hair, the same green eyes. But something had changed. A new confidence had appeared in his eyes. He turned on his phone and saw several missed calls from his father. Son, if something happened, call immediately. We love you. Brian dialed his father's number. Dad, yes, everything's fine. It's all resolved. You can pick me up. I'm at the main entrance. Master Chen was right, he thought. Balance has been restored. Stepping out of the restroom, Brian saw an empty hallway. Mike, Tom, Jake, and Kevin had disappeared. Only a few students lingered. Anna Martinez stood by the wall, her eyes wide open. Brian, what happened? A small misunderstanding, he pulled out his backpack, which has been resolved. And where's Brad? He went on business. He has more important matters now. Anna looked at him closely. You look different. And I feel different, Brian smiled calmly. I feel balanced. What does that mean? That tomorrow will be a better day. He slung the backpack over his shoulder, and all the days that follow too. As he exited the college, Brian saw his father's car. David Myers, a tall man with reddish hair touched with gray, looked worried. Brian, are you okay? What happened? I'm fine, Dad. Brian got into the car. Just resolved some issues. What issues? Adjustment difficulties. But now everything is sorted out. David noticed something new in his son. In the way he held his head, in the expression of his eyes. If someone was bothering you, we can go to the administration. Dad, Brian turned to his father, and he saw a new maturity in his eyes. Trust me, no one will bother me anymore.